Hello to everyone in our audience, and especially to those of you watching from our virtual hub. My name is Duncan Dykes, and welcome to Doc Edge 2022. Our guest today is Phil Grabsky, director of My Childhood, My Country, 20 Years in Afghanistan. Sorry for the flub on your name there. Phil, it's so wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you very much. It's an honor for me.
So just to give a rundown of how this is going to work, I'll start us off with a couple of questions. And then we'll throw to some questions from our audience. So if you're watching from our virtual hub, then you can put some questions in the chat, and then we'll be able to bring those up on screen and put them to Phil himself. So Phil, just to start with, how did you first come across the story, and was it always intended to be a 20-year journey?
First thing I'm going to point out is that this is very much co-directed with my Afghan colleague, Shoaib Sharifi, who is still in Kabul. The prompt for this film was in 2001. I, like so many people, was looking at Afghanistan in the news. And one of the big news stories, March 2001, was the destruction of the Buddhas of Bamiyan. And this was front page around the world. And then, of course, 9/11 and the invasion of Afghanistan, the US-led NATO intervention, they like to call it. And I just started thinking to myself, I wonder, who are the Afghans? You know, we've heard about them and we see them, but they can't all be black-bearded, malevolent terrorists. They can't all be mute women behind their blue burqas. And I was fortunate in that camera technology had evolved very quickly at the end of the 1990s and going into the 2000s. And I realized I could just get on a plane with one of these new, very good cameras and go and find out for myself. And that's what I did. I basically got on a plane, flew to Islamabad actually, and picked up, met my Afghan colleague at that time. And then we flew up to Kabul in search of a story. Now, it doesn't matter, in a sense, what the issue is. Cinema and television, digital platforms, whatever, films are about storytelling. You cannot take for granted that anybody's interested in anything. You have to make people interested. And it's all about the narrative. Now, I could easily have made a film in Kabul, which was destroyed. I mean, it was wrecked. It was absolutely wrecked. But in some ways extremely impressive as well. There was obviously a lot going on at that time. This is July 2002. I was the first filmmaker into Afghanistan, as far as I know. But I thought, actually, what I'll do is I'll go to Bamiyan. It's got some name recognition about it, but I'd heard there were 200 families living in caves alongside the then destroyed Buddhas of Bamiyan. And I thought, I'll see if I can find a story, see if I can find something that's happening that will drive my narrative. And I struggled for a day or two, and then I made the best decision I think I've ever made in over 250 films, which was to focus on Mir. And what a great choice that was. The first film I made, which was called The Boy Who Plays on the Buddhas of Bamiyan, just covered his life over 1 year. Then I decided, for various reasons, to continue with then my Afghan co-director, Shoaib, to do a 10-year portrait and really see what all this international involvement, what the impact was going to be. I did think that that was it. When we released The Boy Mir 10 Years in Afghanistan in 2011, that was going to be it. But I had one commissioning editor who's been extraordinarily supportive, a German broadcaster, when other broadcasters weren't so supportive, or just said no one's interested in Afghanistan. But this one German broadcaster said to me, we'd really like you to carry on. We want to know what happens to Mir. Long story short, we carried on and ended up doing a 20-year portrait, which was very, very difficult at many times and in many ways. Twice, I remember sitting at this desk thinking, I've got to stop, which I never think. We make 4 art films a year for exhibition on screen, and I never start thinking I can't finish. This was different, but I'm very glad, of course, that we did complete the film.
And so I'm curious, how did you first encounter Mir and his family? What was the first meeting like?
first, it was, I mean, I have such amazing memories from Afghanistan. The drive from Kabul to Bamiyan was just extraordinary. And as an aside, because people do say, oh, nothing was achieved, I'm just going to make one point. First of all, it's just not true. Afghan civil society has changed over the last 20 years. And there's many ways in which things have improved. It's a disastrous situation now, but nevertheless, it's all shades of grey. When you went to Afghanistan in 2002, the big issue at that time, or one of the big issues, was mines. The Russians had just dropped millions of mines on Afghanistan during their time there. No mapping, no one knew where they were. So as you maneuvered your way through Afghanistan, you were constantly seeing these stones by the side of the road or on paths. Red on one side, white on the other. White was safe, red was dangerous, don't go there. Basically, Afghanistan over the last 20 years has been demined by people just on their hands and knees, kind of finding these things in huge fields or going through house by house. Anyway, went to Bamiyan, and I was really eager. The day after I arrived, I got up very early before dawn, went down to the Buddhas just as dawn was breaking on my own. And I thought, I wonder, you know, a few months earlier under the Taliban, if I'd tried to film, I would have been arrested. So I thought, well, here I am. I'm going to start filming. There were 3 guys at 6 a.m. They're already there, and they were sweeping up. They were still sweeping up the rubble of the Buddhas, and they had big shovels and a wheelbarrow. And there's me turning up, just with my camera and tripod. And I thought, okay, I'm going to start filming. I'm going to see what they do. And I didn't even attach the camera properly to the tripod because I thought if I've got to run, I'm going to, you know, I knew I could outrun them. As soon as they saw me, and I thought, okay, what are they going to do? They started singing. And one of them even jumped in the wheelbarrow. And I thought, okay, put away all your preconceptions. Just go with it. You know, this is going to be an adventure. What I hadn't seen was on that very first tape, literally the first tape, this little kid looks down the lens. I don't think he'd ever seen a camera before. So he'd wandered down with 3 of his friends, and this is Mia. And he just looks in the lens and looks away. I kind of saw him because he had an eye infection, and I very quickly was aware of malnutrition, skin diseases from malnutrition, also just the dust in the air. He seemed to have some form of conjunctivitis or something. But he was smiling, and he was always there. He was kind of hovering around me for the next 2-3 days with the biggest, cutest smile, this lovely hat. 3 days into my period there, I'm starting to realize that there is no story except a historic one. People were happy to talk to me, including women in the caves out of sight. But everyone was exhausted, unemployed. There was no drive, there was nothing going forwards. And I asked if somebody could, one evening, maybe the 3rd day in, I asked, could somebody take me into the tunnels and the stairways in the caves? Very exciting. And the men said, no, we're too tired. The kids will take you. You see it in the film. So Mia and 2 of his friends go into these staircases, and all of a sudden it just occurred to me. One, it was very exciting to film because they're running up the stairs and they're looking and they're showing, oh, the Taliban did this and the Taliban did that, in a way that adults wouldn't. And secondly, it just occurred to me that if we focus on a young boy, the audience, you, are going to think, well, what's going to happen to him? What's going to happen to Afghanistan? So not what has happened, civil war, Taliban, Russians, what is going to happen? I also thought one of the advantages of filming a young child is that you just don't know what they're going to do. And that was multiplied tenfold. I mean, the adventures he had. Now, obviously, in the film you've just watched, that's over 20 years. But so there's things that we've had to remove from the earlier films. But in that first film, the boy who plays in the Buddhas of Bamiyan, there are other scrapes he gets into. He goes stealing apples from soldiers. But to give one example, which is in this film, that scene where he is learning how to swim. To my knowledge, he'd never been given a swimming lesson before. And it's one of my favorite scenes that I've ever filmed in 38 years. That I'm filming this little kid blowing up his trousers. I can't do that. I mean, try it. I mean, he's there with his shorts, his trousers rolled up. Trousers expand to be an inflation device, and he jumps in the water and they float. And I had so much of that with him. So the first film was really, very beguiling, and but obviously over the course of the 10 years and then the 20 years, it's much more about Afghanistan and about how this enthusiastic, bright guy, increasingly young adult, no different to you or I, just accident of birth means he has these obstacles time after time. The first thing, of course, which is so clear, I hope, from the film, is that to understand Afghanistan, you have to understand they're extremely poor. Everything goes through this kind of conduit of poverty. Their decisions are based on poverty. Right now, they estimate half the population is hungry. We might have our complaints. I have plenty living in Britain, but I'm not hungry. I know I can get bread in the shop next door, for the time being, at least. In Afghanistan, as you see, their first concerns are, can we somehow get fresh water that we can boil and make tea? And can we somehow get bread? And it's worth bearing this in mind, because when you watch a film like this and you take that on board, you understand why what's happening in Ukraine right now is so extraordinarily not only barbaric and tremendously sad, it's also tremendously important to understand that Egypt, it seems, or so I've read, imports 60% of its grain from Ukraine. If they don't have grain and they don't have bread, people are going to starve, and there's going to be unrest. So these issues become very clear in Afghanistan. And what you see in the film, I hope, is that this is twin track. There are things that are changing, introduction of mobile phones, which made a huge difference. And there are things that are not changing. People are still poor. Women did start to have some rights. They've now all been taken back. And the Taliban were never going to be beaten. So one of the things that we have to ask ourselves as an international community is what could we have done so that we wouldn't be in this position now, where women are essentially almost imprisoned in their own homes now.
Thank you for that. And I think it's especially interesting your point that focusing on Mir, it kind of keeps the audience thinking about like what is the future of this place. It's not just like what is currently happening here, what is it currently suffering from, but where do we actually go from here? And also with his age, I mean, I think the amount of changes he goes through in the 20-year span, because of how old he is when he starts, it creates a great way of being able to track that time very steadily across the course of the film.
I'm passionate about documentary films. I said to some young filmmakers the other day, if you haven't watched My Childhood, My Country, or you haven't decided you're going to watch it, which is the film that's just won the BAFTA, I'm not saying this to show off, but I'm saying that you're not passionate enough about making documentary films. You can be sure in Vienna, every time Mozart, I'm not comparing myself to Mozart, but every time Mozart released a piece of music, every other composer in Vienna would go and listen to it. Every time Picasso released, showed a new painting, every artist in France, in Paris or Barcelona, wherever he was, would go and look at it. Same thing with documentaries. You have to stay on top of these. You have to watch these kind of documentaries. But the thing about it is that, and I was going to say that, and I've watched an awful lot of documentaries over 38 years. I've not seen one that actually follows a young child over a course of 20 years. Obviously, there's the famous 7 Up, 14 Up, 21 Up, but they went back every 7 years, and it was a number of children. So this is one child. So it's a story of youth, a universal story of childhood. Never mind about Afghanistan. But also, we've managed to track his life, and of course, he was tremendously cooperative to stay with us, to not say I've had enough, or it's too dangerous for me, or for the relationship to break down because all of a sudden somebody might be in his ear saying you need to be paid $1 million, or why aren't you in Hollywood? He is a tremendously nice young man. obviously we stay in touch with. Shoaib, who's in Kabul, talks to him 4 or 5 times a week. So we were very lucky as well. Very lucky also in that the woman he married is tremendously articulate. I mean, she's a wonderful woman. And again, heartbreaking right now, her situation. Yeah.
Well, so you've talked a little bit about the kind of precarious nature of working with someone over 20 years and keeping that relationship going. Can you talk a little bit about, in general, the challenges presented by trying to make a film of this scope?
I'm always a little bit cautious about this question because any difficulties that I faced are relatively inconsequential compared to the daily challenges that Mir has. And indeed, the daily challenges that Shoaib has living in Kabul. I should say that Shoaib, over the course of this 20 years, I actually met him in London when he was studying film, but I saw something in him, and he is a remarkable man. But during the course of this 20 years, he rose to become the head of the BBC, excuse me, head of the BBC in Kabul. And it's one of the ironies of what's happened over the last year is that the 2 or 3 years prior to the Taliban retaking power, people like Shoaib were targeted. Professionals, judges, electoral officers, obviously police, military, but filmmakers, journalists, photographers. You know, really bright young Afghans, men and women, were assassinated by the Taliban. Sticky bombs were put on their cars, or suicide bombers. While I think it is true that we have to reach some kind of accommodation with the Taliban now for Afghanistan to have any to help Afghanistan, we must never forget that you know, some of the murderers are now in power, and they were brutal. But the irony is, by them being in power, it's become safer in Kabul because there are no suicide bombers. I mean, ISIS is starting to cause a problem. So this means Shoaib can now walk to work, which he wasn't able to do for 2.5 years. So it's a complicated situation. Remind me of your question. Oh, the precarious nature.
The challenges. Yes.
So for me as a filmmaker, there were a number of challenges. I think in some ways, the challenge which I would focus on first is the creation of a film, which has to do, first of all, nobody wants to go to the cinema or would be encouraged to go to the cinema if they feel they're going to be lectured. It's part of the problem with films about, say, the environment, is that people think, yeah, we know. You have to be drawn in by storytelling. You know, I made a film about Muhammad Ali where actually I'm talking about other issues as well, but people are drawn in because it's Muhammad Ali and he's funny and the boxing footage is great. So when you're making a film, I'm doing a film right now about Edward Hopper. Whenever we do these exhibition on screen art films, you've got the top layer, which is the biography, but underneath that, there's other issues. Mary Cassatt, we just made a film about her, which is actually about female artists. Well, actually, she didn't even really like that term, but it's about how she promoted the fact that women artists should be treated with the same respect as male artists. Anyway, so the number one issue was finding the subject. How do I best tell this story in a way which is going to be really appealing? So thinking about your general views, thinking about the soundtrack. I mean, I basically worked with a composer before I even went to Afghanistan. But certainly after the first trips, that was a very important relationship. And just the storytelling of it. On another level, of course, you've got security issues. And I would be, I have the utmost respect for journalists that are working in places like Ukraine right now, day after day, because it's really tough. And a lot of those journalists now are probably not getting the support, or they're freelancers that have just gone off on their own trying to sell footage to news agencies, and they perhaps haven't even been properly trained. You know, I did do some training. I had the knitting needle in my bag in case I found myself in a minefield. The only way you're going to get out is by putting this knitting needle into the soil at 45 degrees. And if you hit something metallic, you know that's a mine. So but basically the first time I went, the issue with mines. Then it started to become kidnapping, and Westerners started to be kidnapped, and then some ransoms were paid. And of course, as soon as the ransoms start to be paid, more people get kidnapped, and then the Taliban came back. So there were issues. Fortunately, where Mir was in the center of Afghanistan was safer than other parts of the country. But then it became too dangerous for me. So Shuaib started doing more of the filming, but also it became dangerous for Mir to be seen, to be filmed by a Westerner. So there were these issues, but then there's also issues just of technology. You're working in just making sure that you film everything where there might be power problems. So how do you charge your batteries? Or there's lots of sand and dust in the air. So how do you keep the cameras clean? Sound, how do you get, you've got to get good sound. So there's all those kind of technical things, and you're working on your own, or in my case with Shuaib. And then going even beyond that, you've got a lot of material to edit. And the one thing I regret, I wish I'd learned Dari. I tried to learn some basic Dari, and it never quite, I'm not sure I ever quite got the accent. One of the things I do when I make films is I do try to learn the language. It's a bit less relevant now with the art films, but in the past I've learned Spanish, Italian, Portuguese to help me make the films. And I wish I'd really worked harder to learn Dari. And that's something I would recommend to filmmakers. If you're going to do a long-term project, you really should try very hard to pick up the language.
I'm sorry to cut you off there. I think we're going to go now to some questions from the audience.
Good.
So our first question we have is from Jacob. Are you still in contact with Amir? Has anything changed for him?
Yeah, Mir, M-I-R. We're in contact with him all the time. Particularly Shuaib, who lives in Kabul, or he travels between London and Kabul. He's dual national, so he's able to. He's still working for the BBC. Mir has, he chose to stay in Afghanistan. He loves his country. He didn't want to leave. And we're in the process. We're going to release the film to cinemas in September, where there will be an update of what's happened to Mir over the course of this year. We still need to be a little bit cautious about things, because it's still slightly unclear what the Taliban attitude is really to journalists and filmmakers. Suffice to say, however, his career as a filmmaker was severely interrupted, or news journalist was severely interrupted by the return of the Taliban. You'll have seen that one of the things that his production company did was film football. Well, all sport was stopped. And some of the things that they filmed was women's cycle races, women's basketball. So Mir would go and film these. That's definitely stopped. They say that men's Premier League or football might return. So his career as a filmmaker has been severely impeded. So he's trying to find alternative ways of earning a living.
Well, to go to our next question from Charlotte, we have, was Mir's wife reluctant to get involved with the movie, or was she more open to it?
So one of the things I found out quite quickly when I went to Bamiyan was that women were willing to talk. I have to say, it does partly depend where you are in Afghanistan. And as you've seen in the film, Mir is Hazara. There are 4 main ethnic groups in Afghanistan. Pashtun, who tend to be south and east and tend to form the Taliban. Hazara, Uzbek, and Tajik. The Hazara are a little bit more relaxed about some things. They're Shia Muslim, which has caused some problems with the Sunni. Some problems, caused some severe problems with the Sunni Taliban. But I found that the women in Bamiyan were willing to talk, but, behind, I was going to say closed doors, there weren't always doors, but in the cave, out of sight. a lot of times it's people are concerned about how other people are seeing them. But there's absolutely no guarantee that Mir would marry somebody. Well, we didn't know he'd get married, but assuming he was going to get married, we didn't know he'd marry somebody that would want to be filmed, or would be articulate. And it's testament partly to Shuaib, who obviously is the one that converses with her, but she was very quickly very relaxed with what we were doing, supported it, and was tremendously articulate. I mean, I nothing but the highest respect for her, you know, and just sheer hard work that she has to do, bringing up three young boys. As she says in the film herself, I mean, she's not educated, and I'm sure that had she been given an education in that school, and before the Taliban returned, she very easily could have gone off and done anything she wanted to, really. And we're still, you know, we'd still like to help her in some way in the future. Well, we're helping her a bit now, but no, she was happy to be filmed and happy with the film.
Well, thank you for that. Sorry, for our next question we have from Caitlin, it looks like. How are you as a filmmaker different by the end of the film compared to where you started? So 20-year span, that covers a big chunk of your entire career, really.
Well, I had hair when I started. How am I different as a filmmaker? I'm not sure the answer to that question. I mean, in 2002, when I went, I'd already been making films for about 15 years, and they were, but a lot of television films. I did a big series on the rise and fall of the Roman Empire for the BBC, and I'd done a biography of, as I said, of Muhammad Ali and one of Pele, but I was getting a little bit tired of television and what television was looking for, and I wanted to kind of explore the possibilities of cinema. So since starting this film, I mean, absolutely, our primary focus with many of our films is cinema. And I've been to Australia and New Zealand 5-6 times, touring cinemas with films. And I think that's changed the way that I make films and the way that I distribute films, engage with audiences. It is different if you're making something for a big screen as opposed to, however big your television, it's still not the same. I think I'm probably a little bit more outspoken maybe than I was 20 years ago. I mean, I do speak publicly about, I think there's been a diminution of public service responsibility by broadcasters. I think what broadcasters show makes a difference to society, and they can't always hide behind this idea that we deliver to the audience what they want, because I think that one, they often get that wrong, and two, you can create an interest. So I'm still really struggling right now with this film has been shown in many television stations around the world, but not the United States, and I struggle with that. And I've had emails where they say our audience is not interested in Afghanistan, and I find that really difficult to accept, because you've got over 2,000 soldiers killed, $2 trillion spent, billions more has to be spent looking after those soldiers and airmen or airwomen come back, and will need to be cared for the rest of their lives, whether physically or emotionally. And the lessons that you can learn from Afghanistan about what was done right, what was done wrong, will apply constantly and frequently into the future. I think Biden, for example, just made a terrible mistake. They froze $7.5 billion worth of Afghan assets in American banks, and the Taliban said, we need that back. We've got a non-functioning economy here. We need the money back. And Biden said, well, 3.75 billion of that I'm going to give to survivors of 9/11. Well, there were no Afghans on those planes. Yes, Afghan was hosting, if you like, Osama bin Laden, so there's a connection there, but that's Afghan money. And I have no admiration for the Taliban, but that isn't really Biden's money to give. I mean, the United States, if it wants to help those poor people that survived or had relatives that were killed, sadly, by 9/11, they have enough funds to do it. Don't use Afghan money. And the other 3.75 billion, they're saying, well, we're going to decide what aid projects this money can go on. These are domestic vote-winning decisions by Biden, and it shows to some extent that lessons have not been learned about how you help a country like Afghanistan. I say at the end of the film, the ratio of aid to military spend was 20 to 1. Well, military spend 20 to 1 more than aid. And ultimately, long term, I think that's it's almost like the wrong way around. What needed to happen, and I'm willing to hear other views on this, but I think that once the Taliban had withdrawn, been defeated, whatever you want to say, in 2001, it should pretty quickly, the whole thing should have turned to how do we help you rebuild, rather than how do we defeat the Taliban, how do we burn all the opium. It was too destructive and aggressive, and it should have been much more, we're here long term to help you. So rather than the Italians being given the constitution to oversee, or all these kind of strange decisions, there should have been a longer term view of, okay, you've got no working road system, we'll build you roads, we'll build you hospitals, we'll build you schools. Now, some of this happened, but it wasn't in a concerted long term way. And long term, Afghans would have grown to really appreciate the West. Whereas there are plenty of Afghans now who say, we're so glad that you've all left, leave us to it, we'll sort it out ourselves.
Now, sorry, we're running a little bit short on time, so I've got 2 more questions. One is from Amelia here. Were you able to make the film pre-COVID, or did COVID factor into it, especially in those latter couple of years?
The only impact that COVID had really was that there was a short period when Mir's company couldn't work. Everything shut down, so you see him becoming a bricklayer. He never sits around. He's absolutely not lazy. Some of that is because he can't. He has to go and earn money. And we put that in the film deliberately to show these countries don't have their kind of unique, we're all connected. Why was Mir and his family living in that cave in 2001? It wasn't because they were fleeing the Taliban, it's because they were fleeing drought. Again, to understand Afghanistan, you have to understand that it's very marginal. It's deforested largely, so just finding something to burn, to boil the water they've got from the stream to make it clean enough to drink is an issue. I was told you can be hung for chopping down a tree. Don't know if that's true, but it does reflect that there aren't many trees around. When I traveled through Afghanistan in those early years, every single building was wrecked, and you look closely, there was no windows, there was no doors, there was no roofs. And I said to an Afghan, I said, God, I can't believe it. Every single building was damaged in this war. He said, no. People were fleeing drought, and then other people would come and steal all their wood. So all the wooden doors, all the wooden windows, all the wooden beams for the roof, because wood's so valuable. I don't know how I got to wood from COVID. We'll move on to the next question. I can see it on the screen. What were the things that almost made me give up?
Yes, and I think this will be our last question of the night as well.
The hardest issue for me, and I'm sure there's some filmmakers in the audience who will understand this, actually, I loved going to Afghanistan. I love Afghan people. I love the challenge of making this film. The creative side of it, the travel side of it, the filmmaking, loved all that. The thing that ground me down was fundraising. And you'd think after that first film, which won, I don't know how many awards, 13, 14 awards, you see this little kid growing up, You'd think then it would be easy to make a film where I go to the broadcasters and say, I now want to follow this kid for 10 years. And we'll see what's happening to Afghanistan, where our military is heavily engaged. We're spending billions. And they say, oh, Afghanistan. No, that's last year's story. We're only interested in Iraq right now. Or, you know, you move through the years, it became, we're only interested in Syria. One broadcaster said to me, well, we've done Syria, so we don't need to do Afghanistan. It's like, what? And yet you turn on the television, every night of the week I can watch something about extreme Americans, Americans with tigers, or Americans that have ripped people off, or, I mean, just American stuff, endlessly, drama, murder. And yet somehow we could only have one film about, I mean, Syria and Afghanistan are even in the same. So the big thing for me was this constant, no, we can't help you. And then even when a broadcaster would say, oh, we're interested, but we have to see the finished film. We basically made this film. I mean, the German broadcaster, who were extremely supportive, and I've got nothing but good things to say for them, their license fee came at the end when we'd finished the film, just because it was easier for me to contract it that way. So we basically had to pay for the whole thing. That's a stress. And, you know, there were times when we just thought, it's so expensive. Is anyone actually going to show it? So that was the biggest challenge. But I think what you have to do is you just have to keep going. And, you know, obviously once we've completed the film, we're absolutely delighted with it. And now what's great is that it's starting to get a life of its own. This morning I had I was saying to you before we started, you know, I've been to the United Nations in Brussels and shown it, and had a conference where the film was part of it. I just had an email today from a similar kind of thing. Ultimately, all of this, winning the BAFTA and the other awards that we've won, or whatever, is just encouraging people to watch the film, think about Afghanistan, and not turn away from Afghanistan in any little way that one can. And I know, you know, there's so many other countries you could focus on too, but we should continue to help Afghans, because it's just by the accident of birth that I'm able to work as a filmmaker, and Mir right now is not. I'm no different to him. I'm no smarter than he is. And we are, despite all the problems and all the issues and fuel going through the roof and whatever it is, we are wealthy compared to Afghanistan, and we should help them.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for all that. And again, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. And considering how much of a struggle it was to get the film made, I hope you're really enjoying the BAFTA attention, the audience that around the world is now watching the movie.
Thank you very much.
Now, to those of you in our audience, if you haven't had a chance to see the film yet, you absolutely should. It's available online until the 10th of July. And to those of you in our virtual hub, our exhibitions will stay open for another hour, so feel free to check those out as well. Otherwise, yeah, one last thank you, Phil. It's been really great having you.
And I look forward to coming back to New Zealand soon, either with this film or one of our exhibition on screen films.
We look forward to having you. All right.